going to be talking about Wittgenstein and naturalism, and what I'm going to be saying will resonate with both topics. Let me start with the naturalism end of it, because my own work is naturalistic in a sense that I think may be somewhat eccentric, maybe outside the mainstream, inclusive and not an exclusive sense of naturalism. All right, okay, so that's the easy part. Now I want to get into the question of the background. And I'm embarrassed by the inadequacy of my account, but let me spell it out, and then we'll open it up to discussion. What exactly is what I call the thesis of the background? In its most general form, it's the claim that all intentionality, including, and I think emphatically including, the intentionality of language, only functions given a background of capacities, dispositions, tendencies, abilities, and other causal structures that do not themselves consist in intentional phenomena. In order to work, in short, such things as beliefs and desires and sentences, in order to work with them, you have to have a set of abilities that don't consist in more beliefs, desires, and sentences. And an argument for this is that if you look at sentences, if you examine sentences that you use to perform speech acts, it turns out that the literal semantic content of the sentence, the literal meaning by itself, isn't really sufficient to determine the interpretation of the speech act. What more is required? Well, take any sentences. Take the sentence, I am attending a Wittgenstein conference in Hertfordshire, England. Now, it seems to me you've got to have an awful apparatus in order to understand sentence. You get to a lot of things that don't look like their beliefs in the ordinary sense in which I believe that Hertfordshire is part of England. So, for example, is it one of my beliefs that conferences are generally held at or near the surface of the Earth, rather than, say, on Mars, or by people floating freely in outer space? Or that during the course of the conference, gravitational attraction continues to work so that most of us will stay at or near the surface of the Earth? Is it one of my beliefs that at least some of the people at conferences are conscious at least some of the time? If there's no consciousness, there's no conference. Now, I think if I believed the negation of any of these, I'd have a different conception of a conference. But it seems odd to think of these as just more beliefs. They get into the hinge department that Daniel talked about. This whole network of beliefs, as well as desires, hopes, and fears, only functions given a backgrounds of things that I take for granted. And many of the things I take for granted are in the form of practices, dispositions, ways of behaving, and general know-how. Now, I think this point will become clearer if you think of what sorts of things I have to have, what kind of abilities I have to have in order to form and carry out the intention to attend such a conference. Without going into details, it seems to me that I have to have a set of skills and bodily capacities. I have to know what it is to get on a bus or a train, to move through space, to deal with other human beings and other human bodies, and in general to be able to have a certain know-how to cope with the environment. Now, of course, I have to have a lot of specific intentionality. I have to be able to know that this is the right bus to get on, or this is the right crossing to get to the de Havilland campus. Not a trivial question, it turned out. But in any case, in addition to all that specific intentionality, I got to have a whole lot of other stuff that I have labeled the background. Now, to begin with, let's consider an immediate objection. You might think, well, the sentence that I took, I'm now attending a Wittgenstein conference in Hertfordshire, England, that's too context-dependent to serve as a model for intentionality generally. That if you take sentences that are more context-free, such as statements in mathematics, it might look like you don't need any such background. And here I'm just going to use an argument from Wittgenstein that I like. Wittgenstein says, we think that 3 plus 4 equals 7, but there might be a tribe that insisted, which sets are you talking about? That if you have A equals 3 and B equals 4, then it'd be A plus B equals 7. But how about in this kind of case, where you have, once again, A equals 3, B equals 4, but A plus B equals 5. Now, who's to say that, well, they're doing arithmetic wrong? They didn't understand the original sense. If they insist on this is the practice of arithmetic in their culture. And I think most logicians would say, yeah, but then they're simply confusing arithmetic, they're simply confusing addition with cardinality of set union. But that won't do either, because let's do cardinality of set union. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. That is, the way we figure the cardinality of set union is as much a function of our practices as the way we did arithmetic in the first place. It's an arresting idea. The idea is that the intentional content is not self-interpreted. You have to know what to do with it. And that you know what to do with it is a matter of the sort of background abilities that you bring to bear. In any case, without arguing the details of this, I'm going to assume that something like this is wrong, that something like this is right, and that the contrary view that says that meanings are really context-free, that the meaning a sentence is what it has in what Fodor and Katz a long time ago in the Chomsky tradition called the null context. I'm arguing there's no such thing as the null context. So the thesis of the background is that in order to fix the truth conditions, or in general the conditions of satisfaction of any sentence, speech act, or intentional state, you require more than just the specific intentional content. You need more than a network of other such contents. Such intentional entities are not self-interpreting, and you have to have a set of abilities in order to interpret them or in order to apply them. Now, I certainly haven't established the thesis of the background, but I'm suggesting if you look at examples around you, pick up a newspaper or listen to a conversation, you will realize that an awful lot of cultural and biological know-how is brought to bear to enable you to understand these utterances. Now, in working on this, I also tried to do a minimal taxonomy of the background, and my efforts here again are reminiscent of Danielle's taxonomy of what she calls the hinge statements in Wittgenstein. So I make a distinction between what I call the deep background, which is common to all human beings, and local cultural practices. And this corresponds roughly to Danielle's distinction between universal hinges and local hinges. Examples of the deep background would be that human beings move about on the surface of the earth, that they're located in space and time, they walk upright and eat through their mouths. Examples of local cultural practices would be such things as what constitutes appropriate behavior for men and women respectively, and how far apart people stand from each other in a conversation, or what sort of posture it's appropriate to adopt in particular situations. And here, my notion of local cultural practices has some affinities with Pierre Bourdieu's notion of the habitus. And Bourdieu, remember, points out that when children are being brought up and they're told things like, stand up straight, mind your manners, what they're acquiring is a set of ways of behaving. They're acquiring what he calls the habitus. And for me, those are local cultural practices. Roughly speaking, it's the shared deep background that makes translation from one language to another possible at all. It is the differences of the local cultural practices that make it difficult. I first read Proust when I was a teenager, when I was about 15 or 16. And I can tell you, those people seem awful strange. I can tell you, a dinner party in the house of the film, and that was not at all like dinner parties in Denver, Colorado. I don't know much of that's not where you can do that kind of behavior. But things are presented in commonsensical tones, whereas in fact the actual account of what's given is of something that is challenging to the background, challenging to our shared set of background presuppositions. Okay, well, now why am I not satisfied with it? Well, of course, it's all very incomplete, and as Austin would say, I can hear him now, it's just loose. And there was no worse condemnation than Austin would have. I mean, he is reporting this, it is much too loose. But there are some theoretical difficulties with the account, even as I presented it to you. And one is that the distinction that I tried to make by saying that the network consists in a set of representations, many of them unconscious, intentional states, and the background consists of a set of abilities, dispositions, and capacities, that you really can't make the distinction in that form, because the unconscious intentional states, when they're unconscious, have an ontology which is such that they exist only as capacities of the brain to produce the state in a conscious form. See, even when I'm sound asleep, it's true to say of me, he believes that George Washington was the first president of the United States. Now, what fact about makes the case that right then and there, snoring away as I am, I believe that George Washington was the first president of the United States, because I believe. And I want to say the only answer is that I have a brain structure which is capable of producing that belief in a conscious form. So I can't make a distinction between the set of abilities and the set of mental states, because most of the mental states at any given time are unconscious, and at that time they exist as dispositional capacities of the brain to produce the state in a conscious form. Now, another objection that I want to get to in a little more detail when we get more into Wittgenstein is that there appears to be a kind of a match between background presuppositions and beliefs. And Danielle, much of this talk is a kind of conversation between me and Danielle, so I'm going to cite her book, and let me repeat again that I think it's a wonderful book. She thinks that a lot of the things that I treat as the background should be treated as what she calls non-propositional, or I think sometimes pre-propositional beliefs. And I'm going to have something more to say about that. But in any case, another distinction is this. On the account that I presented, the thesis of the background is a thesis about the operation of intentionality. It's a thesis about the conditions of possibility of the existence and functioning of perception, action, thinking, speaking, and other forms of mental phenomena, other forms of intentionality. It has implications for epistemology, but there's nothing specifically epistemic about it. Now, many of Wittgenstein's most important remarks about what I'm calling the background, about these issues, are in his book that is specifically about epistemology, the book, the collection of utterances published under the title On Certainty. And I want to say some things now about Wittgenstein's conception. He keeps emphasizing that there are, as he calls them, ungrounded ways of acting, ways of doing things. And these are examples of what I mean by the background. The temptation, and many commentators have yielded to this temptation, is to think that he's making a traditional pragmatist-style plea for the priority of practical reason over theoretical reason. But I think that's a mistaken interpretation. For the purposes of this discussion, thinking and talking are also ways of acting. His point is that the ground of our doing something is not something that in every case has to be hypothesized and established in order for us to do it. Think of children playing a game of football. Now, unless there's a field and a ball, there's no game. And unless the external world exists, there's no field and no ball. But it doesn't follow that the children must first prove the existence of the field and the existence of the ball, and even before that, they must prove or at least believe in the existence of the external world. Rather, in a Wittgensteinian way, we might say they just act. Now, what does that mean when Wittgenstein says they just act? Well, consider another striking quotation from On Certainty. I'm quoting Wittgenstein here. The squirrel does not infer by induction that it's going to need stores next winter as well. And no more do we need a law of induction to justify our actions or our predictions. Now, in my terminology, I would put this by saying that the practice of proceeding by induction is a background ability that we have. It's not something that requires justification, but it's rather the standard by which we justify other things. I think Wittgenstein's claim is correct, but to someone brought up on traditional philosophy, it will seem puzzling. I mean, surely, if we're not talking about squirrels, but if we're talking about human beings, then it seems to be perfectly reasonable for human beings to come and doubt the validity of induction. And it might seem that storing nuts for the winter was simply not rationally justified, even though it might be habitually or practically something that one was inclined to do. But it might seem an act of faith without any rational justification. Certainly that's the Humean conception of justification. Now, what's wrong with such a philosophical conclusion? And indeed, if for some reason you had a genius of a squirrel who could reason in a Humean way, what's wrong with a philosophical squirrel? Well, consider another example. Another case of people who take something as which I'm thinking of as a background presupposition and treat it as a hypothesis is the hypothesis of the existence of the external world. And you remember Kant thought it was a scandal that no one had proven the existence of the external world, so naturally he was going to get busy and do it. And now, why don't we all get busy and do it? And as everyone here knows, Moore thought he had done it. You remember Moore argued, I know that these hands exist. If these hands exist, then the external world exists, so the external world exists, QED. Okay, now let's call it this thesis that the external world exists, call that external realism. Now, I think there was something wrong with Kant's demand for proof of external realism, and that Moore's attempted proof simply misses the point of the question. But notice on the surface, they both look right. Kant sees correctly that unless external realism is true, a rather large percentage of our beliefs and hypotheses, etc., cannot be true. So because so much depends on the truth of external realism, it seems we'd better get busy and establish it, prove it. And indeed, Moore's form of proof is a standard form of proof, which in other contexts we regard as perfectly acceptable. If somebody wants to know whether or not a certain phenomenon exists, for example, are there albino penguins, let's say, then a standard form of proof would be to produce examples. Here are 2 albino penguins, therefore albino penguins exist. Do there exist external objects? Here are 2 external objects, says Moore, my 2 hands, therefore external objects exist. Now, against both Moore and Kant, it seems to me we can present a traditional type of philosophical argument to the effect that the presupposition of external realism is best thought of as a background condition of intelligibility for a very large number of our representations, speech acts, theories, etc. So consider just about any question you could ask. If you want to know whether or not dinosaurs existed in the Pleistocene, whether the Ford Motor Company ever made a car with a 12-cylinder engine, or whether George Washington had false teeth, in every case, it seems, you have to presuppose the existence of a reality independent of your representations. But similarly, if you want to go skiing, visit England, or even eat a good meal, it seems you can only do these if you believe that the real world exists. Now, I'm putting this innocently. We're going to get more sophisticated later on. By the way, this is a problem I always have in philosophy. When you state the initial question, you've got to be really young, a child of innocence. Then there comes a point when you have to be sophisticated. And I've never figured out the algorithm for when you stop being stage here, and we'll say, well, sure, you can't do these things unless you believe that the external world exists. I think it's a mistake to think that this reality has to consist of material objects, as Moore thought, but the background presupposition is that there must be a way that things are independent of our representation of how they are. But if that's right, then what's wrong with the demand that one prove external realism, that one prove that there is a way that things are? And the answer is, at least the beginning of the answer, is that all forms of proof seem to presuppose external realism, and consequently external realism can't be proved without circularity. But then why isn't that a ground for skepticism? If it looks like you can't establish it, if you can't give any good arguments for it, why isn't that a ground for skepticism? And the same argument, as we all know from having read Hume, works for induction. The ability to reason from some instances to all presupposes the validity of induction, so induction cannot be proven without circularity. And why is that not good grounds for skepticism about induction? Okay, now I want to make my first positive point. For any activity, there's a set of facts such that unless those facts obtained, the activity couldn't exist. And that makes it look as if for any activity, anyone engaged in the activity must presuppose or otherwise believe in the existence of those facts. You can't, for example, play a game of football or vote in an election against football and elections exist, unless football and elections exist. So it looks like you have to believe in the existence of such things in order to engage in the activity. But in a lot of philosophically puzzling cases, such as external realism or the validity of induction or the reality of the past or the existence of other minds, it seems one is unable to justify a belief in the existence of the fact, and this in terms looks as if it seems to lead to some kind of skepticism. But now then we have to turn to the main question of this talk, which is the relationship between the background and belief. Many of the examples that Danielle gives in her book, many of the examples that Wittgenstein gives in On Certainty and that Danielle cites as local hinges would not be part of the background in my sense. For example, the fact that Napoleon existed is for me a fact like any other. Of course, as Wittgenstein keeps reminding us, not all of our beliefs are on the same footing. So my belief that Napoleon existed is much more solidly entrenched than, let's say, my belief that his subordinate, Maréchal Ney, was a great military commander. I take it on faith, but it might turn out to be false that Maréchal Ney was a competent general. But neither is part of the background. But when we get to the deep background, such features as external realism or our capacity for inductive reasoning, then I think there is a distinct overlap between my conception of the background and what Danielle calls universal hinges. But she cites all of these as cases of belief, or belief in at least one sense of belief, and I'm now going to try to sort out some of these issues. She claims that some beliefs are non-propositional, and this enables her to construe objective certainty as a kind of belief, and she gives three reasons for doing that. First, it enables us to ascribe belief to animals and non-linguistic humans. Secondly, it's the way we describe our own hinges when they're challenged. Somebody says, well, you don't really know that you have two hands. You say, well, I believe that I have two hands, you might say, if the hinge were challenged in this case. And third, she says, we can think of belief as a continuum going from primitive non-propositional attitudes to more sophisticated propositional attitudes. Now, my way of thinking about these matters is totally different, and I'm not sure where the object of the assertion that Obama is president is Obama. The object of the belief that Obama is president is Obama. In both cases, the proposition is the content of the assertion or the belief, and indeed, I want to say it's constitutive. And as I say, I used to think that was harmless, but I think it's been a disaster for cognitive science because it's tempting to think. A relationship between me and some mental entity, a proposition, or on the computational version of this, a sentence in the language of thought. Okay, now that's the, I'm going to, since we're in a Wittgensteinian vein here, I'm going to number proposition. That was number 1. Now you get number 2. 2, there is no such thing as non-propositional belief. All beliefs are beliefs that. But this is because every belief has to set a condition. It has to set a truth condition, just as every desire has to set a satisfaction condition, and every intention has to set a carrying out condition. Conditions are by definition propositional because every condition is a condition such that. It's a condition that such and such obtain. To put this point succinctly, there's a tight connection between belief, proposition, conditions, and truth. Every belief sets a truth conditions. Truth conditions are by definition propositional because a condition is always a condition that such and such, and a truth condition is precisely the proposition, is set by the propositional content of the belief. Proposition number 3, there's no need whatever to postulate a continuum of senses of belief that goes from animals and non-linguistic humans at one end and us inveterate talkers at the other. The sense in which my dog Gilbert believes someone is at the door and the sense in which I believe someone at the door is exactly the same sense. In both cases, there's a belief with a propositional content, directions of fit, conditions of satisfaction, in this case, truth conditions. And by the way, the linguist tests for non-ambiguity, namely conjunction reduction, works beautifully in this case. I believe that someone is the door. Gilbert believes that someone is at the door. So Gilbert and I both believe. I tend to fool Gilbert into believing that there's someone at the door. And here's how I do it. I go knock, knock. And then I say, open the door and shout, hello! And Gilbert will come charging in, barking vigorously because he believes someone is at the door. I've given you solid evidence for this. Well, I don't go into detail, but I'm telling you, there isn't any question that animals have belief, and I think it is, as I used to tell Donald Davidson, it's worse than bad philosophy to deny that animals have beliefs. It's bad biology. Okay, so that was my third proposition, that you don't need to postulate a continuum. But now we get more to the crunch. What's the relationship between belief and the background? And the general point I want to make is this. For any activity, there's a set of facts such that unless those facts obtained, the activity could not exist. It looks like, then, for any activity, anyone engaged in the activity must believe in or presuppose or otherwise stand in some intentional relationship to the existence of those facts. As I said earlier, I can't vote in an election unless there's an election, so it looks like my voting must presuppose a belief in the existence of the election. But similarly, it seems that children can't play a game of football unless external realism is true. No real world, no real game of football. So it looks like the children must be metaphysicians after all. They must believe in external realism. But for many philosophically puzzling phenomena, we don't know how to justify the belief in the relevant facts. How do we justify external realism, the existence of other minds, the reality of the past, the validity of induction, and a host of other philosophical chestnuts? Proposition 5. One of the consequences of the thesis of the background is this. You can engage in an activity which could not exist unless certain facts existed. You can engage in that activity without having a belief or other intentional state about those facts. And that, I think, is one of the things that I've learned from Wittgenstein. Now, how is this possible? Here we come to Wittgenstein's thesis of the primacy of acting, of practice. We just do it. We don't first have to prove the existence of the external world before playing football or hammering the nail into the board. We just haul off and play football or hammer. When the background is functioning as a background, as skills, it does not function in the way of beliefs or hypotheses. Now, I once put this point as follows. Now, the single most boring thing any lecturer can do is quote his previous writings on the subject by the understanding of it. Realism, I want to say, is not a hypothesis, belief, or philosophical thesis. Realism is part of the background in the following sense. My commitment to, quote, realism is exhibited by the fact that I live the way that I do. I drive my car, drink my beer, write my articles, give my lectures, and ski my mountains. Now, in addition to all of these activities, each a manifestation of my intentionality, There isn't a further hypothesis, quotes around that the real world exists. My commitment to the existence of the real world is manifested whenever I do pretty much anything. It's a mistake to treat that commitment as if it were a hypothesis, as if in addition to skiing, drinking, eating, etc., I held a belief. There's a real world independent of my representation of it. The idea that I'm militating against is that, look, I'm arguing against that conception. I say this passage was misunderstood by at least some of my critics, and the point I'm making is that when an activity presupposes something, it doesn't follow that you have to have a belief in the existence of that something in order to engage in the activity. Okay, but now we get to a crucial philosophical question. All the same, couldn't we form a belief? Couldn't we state the universal hinges as beliefs in the way that Daniel does? And the answer is that we could, and indeed as philosophers we typically do. But the point is that when the background is functioning as background, it doesn't function in the way that beliefs function. Well, how do beliefs function? In the last presidential election, I voted for Obama because I believed he would be a better president than McCain. Now, that's an example of how a belief functions. I thought about it. Voting for Obama was so politically correct that I was immediately suspicious of it. But I did think about it a lot and came up with a belief, yeah, okay, he really is better than the other guy. So reluctantly, I voted for him. Now, that's how beliefs function. But when I eat lunch, I don't in that way eat lunch because I believe the external world exists. I don't, as I ponder who's the best candidate, I don't ponder the reality of the lunch or the nature of external realism when I eat lunch. I don't engage in my activities in the basis of my background, my belief, on the basis of my background beliefs. Well, what then is the basis? And here it seems to me, again, Wittgenstein is right. The activity is in this sense ungrounded. We just do it. We don't first have to establish the conditions of possibility of doing it. Now, another and maybe even more obscure way to put this point is to say that the belief derives from the activity and not the activity from the belief. We don't first have the belief and then on that basis engage in the activity. Rather, we just engage in the activity, and later on we can form beliefs about the conditions of possibility, about the conditions under which it's possible to engage in the activity. Well, okay, we're up to proposition number 8. What then exactly is the relationship between beliefs and deep background? Well, let's assume that I'm right, that there are no such things as non-propositional beliefs. Let's suppose that for any activity, there are a set of propositions such that if they were not true, the activity couldn't take place. Where deep background is concerned, we can always formulate those propositions as sets of beliefs that the participants in the activity must have. Now, again, that's the picture I've been arguing against. And the argument I've been giving is, first, the belief does not provide the ground for the activity. The activity is ungrounded, and it doesn't need a ground, and you can see that in the case of animals. That was the part of the point of the squirrel storing nuts for winter. It isn't just that the squirrel is a bad philosopher who hasn't thought about the deep problem of induction. The squirrel doesn't need to do any philosophy at all, and yet it does store nuts for the winter. It's justified in doing so, but it doesn't store nuts for the winter because it believes we've solved the problem of induction. That's not the correct account. Secondly, you can always formulate a belief, but the belief derives from the activity and not the activity from the belief. Again, in the case of animals, the animals have the activity, but they don't have the conceptual apparatus to formulate the belief. Third, where traditional philosophical background practices are concerned, to treat the presuppositions as hypotheses or beliefs inevitably leads to skepticism, because how would we ever justify those beliefs? Okay, but now I come to the next proposition. I think my numbering is even worse than usual, but it's some damn fool number or other. This is not, what I'm giving you is not a refutation of skepticism. It doesn't show that skepticism is false or that it's been refuted, but it is, in this sense, therapeutic. It's designed to show that the power of skepticism derives from the fact that we assimilate the skeptical challenge to the wrong model. We treat the challenge as one of providing evidence for a hypothesis or a belief. But in the cases where the skeptic is challenging us, is challenging our background ways of behaving, in the case where the skeptic is challenging us here, we don't act on the basis of a hypothesis or belief. Our actions are ungrounded, not because they need a ground, which we've somehow or other failed to provide, but because they don't need a ground. We can and do just act. Okay, proposition number 8. Another way to put this same point is this. If I believe the negation of certain propositions, I couldn't engage in the activities that I do engage in. But it doesn't follow from this that when I do engage in the activities, it's on the basis of my beliefs. So if I believe that the people around me right now, let's say, suppose I believe that they're unconscious automata, then I couldn't respond to them as I do. But it doesn't follow from that fact that in order for me to respond to them as I in fact do, I must hold the belief that they are all conscious. From the fact that if one doubted a proposition P, one would no longer be able to engage in a certain form of normal behavior, it doesn't follow that one engages in the normal form of behavior. One is thereby in some intentional state such as belief or presupposition, whose content is P. So if I truly doubted that this floor was solid, that it was that you could walk on it, then my behavior would be quite different. I would be much more gingerly as I move around than I am in fact. But it doesn't follow from that when I am walking around on it, I have this very quiet belief. It's solid. It's okay to walk on it. I don't need that. I just act. I just walk. Similarly, if I doubted that the thing in front of me is a table, then it would alter my behavior. But it doesn't follow from that I must form the belief that either that the ground underneath me is solid or that the object is a table. I can, if I wish, form the belief, but now, and this is the other point I wanted to make, the belief derives from my capacity for the action and not conversely. You just act, or you're just able to act, and then on the basis of your acting or your capacity, you can then form an intentional state. You can say, well, I then believe that the ground underneath me was solid. But to repeat the point, it is my capacity for acting that is prior to the belief, not the belief that forms the ground for the capacity for acting. So, conclusion. I said I was dissatisfied with my account of the background, and I still am. But maybe we've made a little progress. As is so often the case with Wittgenstein, he tries to get us to see the phenomena in a new light, from a different perspective. The traditional view, which Wittgenstein was militating against in various forms of the inventory, everybody agrees to that. But it is the inventory conception which Wittgenstein is attacking. Now, he lived before the ascendance of the computational theory of the mind, but I think he would have attacked it for the same sort of reasons that he attacked the inventory conception. On the computational conception, there's still an inventory of mental states. Introspection drops out. I mean, in the view that Wittgenstein was attacking, all the members of the inventory are somehow introspectively accessible, and we're thinking of the meanings of words in particular on this inventory conception as a set of introspectable entities. And one of his most powerful arguments is that's not how meanings work. Meanings work because of your abilities, not because you have a set of images. But in any case, on the current view, which again grew up after Wittgenstein's death, mental processes are thought of computational processes operating on the formal structure of the members of the inventory. Now, against this conception, I have argued that the states only work, they only function against the background of capacities, tendencies, dispositions, etc., that cannot be accurately thought of as further states. Corresponding to these background capacities, we can always form beliefs, but we mistake the character of the operation of the background if we think it's based on beliefs. On the contrary, the operations are typically ungrounded. They're not based on anything in the way that traditional epistemologists thought of as foundations. Of course, our practices are grounded in our biology and in our culture, but these are not foundational in the Cartesian or the Husserlian sense because they don't give us justifications. The belief about the background practices derives from the practices rather than forming a justification of the practices.